Valerie Reeves knew the meeting was over when Michelle asked where she wanted the sewing chest delivered. They were sitting in a conference room at the family attorney's office in Laconia. Snowmelt streaked the windows. A wet salt stain marked the carpet beneath Gary's chair, and the clock above the filing cabinets made a small clicking sound every second. The attorney, Martin Bell, had just finished reading Edward's will. Gary received Reeves' hardware, its inventory, and the business accounts. Michelle and her husband, Kevin Blair, received the paid-off house on Pine Grove Lane. The remaining savings were divided between Edward's two children. Valerie received her personal clothes, one suitcase listed on an attached inventory, and Rose Reeves's old sewing chest. That was all. Martin closed the folder before him. There are some routine estate expenses to settle. Kevin has offered to help Gary coordinate those. Kevin nodded as if someone had appointed him chairman of the room. Valerie looked at the papers in front of her. Her own copy was only 6 pages. She read the paragraph containing her name again, then rested both hands over it. The skin around her nails was still split from washing medicine cups and changing bed linens. She'd stopped using hand cream during Edward's final month because the fragrance bothered him. "Is there another page?" she asked. Martin glanced at the folder. "No, I mean for me." The question embarrassed him. She saw it in the way he adjusted his glasses. "The personal property memorandum is attached." "I saw that." Gary leaned back. At 47, he had Edward's broad shoulders and his habit of pressing his lips together before saying something unpleasant. "Dad was very specific," he said. Valerie turned toward him. "Did he tell you that?" "He told all of us, in his way." Edward had spent his last week unable to lift a glass without help. Gary had visited for 40 minutes on the Sunday before he died. Michelle had stayed longer, though most of that time she sat downstairs answering messages. Neither had asked Edward about a will in front of Valerie. Martin cleared his throat. The document was properly witnessed. It reflects the estate plan on file with this office. "What happens to the lake camp?" Kevin asked. It was the first question he'd asked since they sat down. Martin opened the folder again. "The Loon Cove Road parcel isn't included in the list of specific bequests. So it falls into the remaining estate," Kevin said. "I'll need to review the title history." Gary gave a tired shrug. "It's barely standing. We'll have it assessed and sell the lot." Michelle looked at Valerie then, but only briefly. Dad hadn't used it in years. Valerie knew the place they meant. She had been there twice during her marriage, both times long ago. It was a small cottage behind a wall of spruce and brush, with a crooked dock and a boathouse that leaned toward Lake Winnipesaukee. Edward called it the camp, never the lake house. In recent years, he'd spoken of it only when a tax bill came. Valerie had no reason to believe it mattered now. She looked back at Martin. "Edward and I were married 22 years. No one answered. I left my job to care for him." "We know," Michelle said quietly. "No, you know I stopped working. That isn't quite the same thing." Michelle's face tightened. She had come to the meeting in a cream wool coat that probably cost more than Valerie's monthly pay had at the craft shop. She folded the belt across her lap. "This is hard for everyone." Valerie watched her stepdaughter smooth the fabric with one thumb. "Yes," Valerie said. "It is." Gary pushed his chair back. "We shouldn't turn this into a fight." Valerie hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused anyone. Still, somehow, she was already the person threatening a fight. Martin slid a small ring of keys toward Michelle. "These are for Pine Grove Lane. Valerie remains in the property temporarily while personal items are sorted." "How temporarily?" Kevin asked. Michelle looked at him. "Kevin, we need a date. Insurance, utilities, all of it has to transfer." Gary stared at the table. He knew what Kevin was asking, and he was glad not to ask it himself. Martin spoke carefully. 30 days is customary and reasonable." Valerie felt the words arrive one at a time. 30 days to leave the house where she'd lived since 2004. 30 days to sort 22 years into what belonged to Edward's children and what could fit beside her in a rented room. 30 days after spending 3 years arranging her life around medication alarms, oncology visits, broth, clean sheets, and the changing sound of Edward's breathing. Michelle finally met her eyes. "We're not putting you out on the street," she said. "We'll help you find somewhere." Valerie gathered the 6 pages and placed them in her handbag. "You've already decided where I don't belong," she said. "I can manage the rest." She stood. Her knee caught for a moment, stiff after the long meeting. She waited until it released, then buttoned her coat. Martin asked if she wanted him to have someone carry the sewing chest to her car. "I don't have a car," Valerie said. That was another thing nobody in the room had considered. Edward's truck went with the hardware business because it was registered to the store. Gary looked at his watch. "I can bring the chest by tomorrow." Michelle picked up the house keys. "Or we could dispose of it." "Honestly, Valerie, it's not worth moving." "It belonged to Rose," Valerie said. "It's full of old thread." "I know what's in it." Michelle did not. None of them did. At that moment, Valerie didn't either. 3 years earlier, the chest had stood beneath the front window in the spare bedroom. Valerie used to place folded fabric on its lid before carrying everything downstairs to the sewing machine. Back then, she still worked 3 afternoons a week at a craft shop in Meredith. She cut batting, helped customers match thread, and repaired sample quilts when their binding came loose. The pay wasn't much, but she liked knowing where every button drawer was. She liked regular customers who came in needing half a yard and stayed to talk for 20 minutes. Edward's diagnosis ended that ordinary life in less than a week. He had been 66 when the doctor told them the cancer had already spread. Gary came to the hospital that first evening. Michelle arrived the next morning with coffee for everyone. Both of them cried in the parking lot. Both promised they would help. They meant it when they said it. Then Gary had trouble at the store. Michelle and Kevin had work, travel, and a house of their own. Treatment settled into its long routine, and promises became holiday visits, short calls, and messages asking Valerie to keep them updated. Valerie kept them updated. She made a group message after every appointment. She listed medication changes and blood results in plain language. She sent good news without decorating it, and bad news without frightening anyone more than necessary. Gary usually answered with a thumbs-up symbol. Michelle wrote, "Thank you for everything you're doing." Edward saw those messages because Valerie showed him. He would read them, hand back the phone, and look toward the window. "They're busy," he said. Valerie never told him that. She was busy too. By the second winter, he needed help in the shower. By spring, he could no longer manage the stairs each night. Valerie moved a narrow bed into the downstairs den and slept on the sofa beside it. She learned which floorboard creaked near the bathroom. She learned to cross it without noise. She could tell from Edward's breathing whether he needed water, pain medicine, or simply her hand against his shoulder. Some mornings he apologized. "You didn't sign up for this," he said once. She was standing at the kitchen counter, crushing a tablet between 2 spoons. "I signed up for you. That was before I got difficult." "You were difficult before." He gave a weak laugh. That laugh carried her through the rest of the day. Edward had never been an easy man. He liked tools returned to their proper hooks and bills paid before the envelope cooled from the mailbox. He could spend an hour repairing a drawer nobody else thought was broken. He disliked discussing money because he believed good management made discussion unnecessary. Valerie had accepted that division early in their marriage. Edward handled accounts, taxes, insurance, and property records. She handled the home and her own small checking account. It had never seemed dangerous while he was alive. In January of 2026, Pamela Cunningham began coming to Pine Grove Lane as Edward's hospice nurse. Pamela was 59, practical and gentle without making a performance of it. She kept spare hair ties around her wrist and wrote instructions in large block letters Valerie could read when tired. "His pain may change quickly now," Pamela told her one afternoon. "You call me. Don't wait because you think it's too late in the evening." Valerie nodded. Pamela looked directly at her. "I mean that." "I know. You haven't been sleeping." "I sleep." "You close your eyes in the same room." "That's not always sleep." Edward heard them from the den. "She's stubborn," he called. Pamela raised her voice. "So are you." For a few weeks, the three of them found a rhythm. Pamela checked Edward's medication and listened to his chest. Valerie changed sheets and measured liquids. Edward complained about the daytime television Valerie left on too low for him to hear. Gary visited on New Year's Day and brought a ham too large for any of them to eat. He stayed in the den with his father while Valerie made coffee. She heard only pieces of their conversation. The store was behind with suppliers. A commercial account had not paid. Gary needed to refinance something before spring. Edward's voice came back stronger than it had all morning. "You don't borrow your way out of bad ordering. I didn't come for a lecture." "What did you come for?" Then both men lowered their voices. When Gary left, he kissed Valerie's cheek and said, "Call me if things change." Things were changing while he said it. That evening, Edward asked Valerie to bring Rose's sewing chest downstairs. The whole chest, if you can manage it? It was a low wooden chest on 4 short legs, wider than a bedside table and heavier than it looked. Rose Reeves had used it for most of her life. After she died in 1998, Edward kept it wrapped in a blanket until Valerie asked if she could clean it. Its finish was dark and scratched. Inside were shallow trays holding wooden spools, hooks, buttons, chalk, thimbles, and folded paper patterns softened by decades of use. Valerie dragged it carefully along the upstairs hall, then called Edward from the bottom step. "I can't carry this alone. Leave it there, it'll block the stairs. Then Gary can move it." Gary just left. Edward closed his eyes. Dennis would know how. Valerie waited. Know how to move a sewing chest? Edward opened his eyes again. No, nothing. Forget it. She should have asked him what he meant. Instead, she was tired, and the medicine alarm sounded from the kitchen. The chest remained upstairs. A week later, Michelle came with Kevin. Michelle brought soup from a restaurant and transferred it into Valerie's bowls as though that made it homemade. Kevin walked through the house, checking windows and asking about the furnace. "Dad said the heating bill was high," he told Valerie. "He's cold all the time. You could lower it at night. He's cold at night too." Kevin gave a reasonable little nod, the kind that made refusal seem wasteful. Michelle sat with Edward while Valerie took a shower. When Valerie returned, she found them speaking quietly. Edward stopped when she entered. Michelle stood and gathered her purse. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was controlled. "He wants to make sure everything is simple." Valerie looked at Edward. "What does that mean?" "After," he said. "After what?" Nobody answered because the answer was lying in the hospital bed. Kevin touched Michelle's elbow. "We should go." At the door, Michelle hugged Valerie longer than usual. "You've been good to him," she whispered. Valerie held still inside the embrace. The words sounded almost like gratitude. Later, she understood they were also a farewell. Edward died before dawn, on the 12th of February. Valerie was beside him. Pamela arrived 20 minutes later, carrying her medical bag, though there was nothing left to treat. The house became very quiet after the equipment company removed the bed. There were rectangular marks in the carpet and 2 dents where the wheels had rested. Gary and Michelle came that afternoon. They stood in the kitchen making lists while Valerie washed Edward's favorite cup. "The funeral home needs a suit," Michelle said. "The gray one?" Valerie replied. "Not the black." The collar bothered him. Gary asked where Edward kept the business papers. "At the store, I think." "You think?" He handled the business. Gary opened the desk drawers in the den. "There should be files here." Valerie placed the clean cup upside down on a towel. "Your father died this morning." Gary stopped searching. For a second he looked ashamed. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to deal with it." "So am I." He closed the drawer, but he did not apologize. The funeral drew more people than the church could seat. Hardware customers stood along the back wall. Men who had worked with Edward years earlier came in clean jackets and work boots. Dennis Franklin sat alone near the aisle, a large, weathered man of 70 who kept his hands folded throughout the service. People told Valerie she had been devoted. They said Edward could not have asked for better care. They pressed her hands and told her to rest now, as if rest were something waiting at home in a labeled box. Gary gave the eulogy. Michelle chose the hymns. Kevin spoke to the funeral director about payment. Valerie went home afterward and found 3 foil-covered casseroles on the counter. She ate none of them. She sat in the den until dark, looking at the pale marks left by Edward's bed. 3 weeks later came the meeting in Laconia. Then came the 30-day deadline. Gary delivered the sewing chest the next afternoon in the hardware store truck. Valerie watched from the front steps as he dragged it toward the edge of the truck bed. "Wait," she said. "The legs will catch. I've got it." "You're pulling it sideways." Gary sighed, climbed down, and turned the chest the way she'd asked. Together, they carried it inside and set it in the front hall. It looked smaller there than it had upstairs. Gary rubbed his lower back. "There. That's Rose's treasure handled." Valerie ran her fingers over a fresh scrape on one corner. She cared about it. Grandma cared about everything she owned. She grew up with nothing. He looked toward the den, then toward the stairs. "Michelle wants to bring a property agent through next week. I still live here. It's just an estimate. She owns the house now. She can wait until I leave." Gary pushed both hands into his jacket pockets. We need to get things moving, Valerie. The store has obligations. What does Michelle's house have to do with your store? It's not Michelle's house. It's part of the estate process. The attorney said it was hers. You know what I mean. Valerie did know. Gary meant that everything Edward had owned now formed one large answer to his problems. The store, the accounts, the home, and the shabby lake camp could all be measured, sold, borrowed against, or divided. Only Valerie stood outside that answer. Gary lowered his voice. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She opened the front door. I have packing to do. He hesitated beside the chest. You should throw that thing out. Half those spools are probably rotten. Valerie looked down at the scratched lid. It's mine, she said. Gary left without another word. The truck backed down the driveway and disappeared between two banks of gray snow. Valerie locked the door, then stood in the hall with the old chest at her feet. She had 30 days, no car, no job, and no claim anyone in that family intended to honor. The chest was the only thing they had not wanted. Valerie bent, placed both hands beneath its lid, and lifted. The hinges complained, then settled. Rose's sewing things lay where Valerie remembered them. 4 shallow trays fitted across the top. One held buttons sorted by color into old pill bottles. Another held hooks, snaps, pins, and a tomato-shaped cushion gone pale with age. Beneath them were folded patterns, scraps of muslin, and dozens of wooden spools. A faint smell of cedar and dust rose from the chest. Valerie lifted the top tray and set it on the floor. She wasn't searching for anything, not yet. She only needed to know whether the contents were useful enough to carry into whatever came next. She found 3 pairs of sewing scissors. One was rusted shut. One had a cracked black handle. The third was small and sharp, with Rose's initials scratched near the hinge. There were needles wrapped in paper, a box of tailor's chalk, and thread in colors nobody seemed to use anymore. Mustard yellow, brownish pink. A green that matched the appliances in the house where Valerie had grown up. At the bottom, beneath a stack of old transfer paper, she found a photograph. Rose stood beside Edward on the dock at Loon Cove Road. The photograph had curled inward at the edges. Rose wore canvas shoes and rolled trousers. Edward was younger than Gary was now, holding a hammer in one hand and squinting into the sun. Behind them stood the boathouse, newly sided and straight. Someone had written a date on the back. August 1987. Valerie sat on the hall floor with the photograph in her lap. Edward had looked happy at the lake, not polite or satisfied, but happy. She tried to remember the last time she'd seen that expression on his face. It had not been during the final 3 years. Illness had taken too much by then. She placed the photograph in her handbag instead of returning it to the chest. That was her first decision. The next morning, Valerie bought a spiral notebook at the pharmacy. It cost $2.19. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything she could call her own. Clothes, shoes, 2 winter coats, mother's blue bowl, wedding photographs, craft supplies bought with her own money, the small television from the spare room, Rose's sewing chest. She paused after writing the last item. Edward's family had begun speaking, as if everything inside the house belonged to the estate. That might be true of most of it. Valerie didn't know. She had spent years trusting Edward to know, and Edward was gone. Now she would write things down. She went room by room. She noted what she had brought into the marriage and what had been given directly to her. She found receipts when she could. She photographed objects with her phone and wrote dates beside them. The work steadied her. At noon, Michelle arrived with a property agent named Carol Benton. Neither had called first. Valerie opened the door, but did not step aside. I asked Gary to tell you, Michelle said. He didn't. Carol stood on the walkway holding a leather folder. She was close to Valerie's age and looked uncomfortable enough to understand the situation. I can come another time, Carol said. Yes, Valerie replied. Michelle's mouth tightened. We're here now, and I live here now, for 3 more weeks. Carol looked down at her folder. Valerie felt heat move into her face. She did not want a scene on the front steps. She also did not want strangers measuring bedrooms while Edward's shirt still hung in the closet. You can come the day after I leave, she said. Not before. Michelle lowered her voice. The house is mine. Yes, I have a right to know what condition it's in. You were here after the funeral. That isn't the same as an inspection. Valerie held the door with one hand. You can inspect it after I return the key. Michelle stared at her. She had expected grief, confusion, perhaps tears. A clear refusal unsettled her. We're trying to do this properly, she said. So am I. Carol stepped backward. I'll call you, Michelle. She walked to her car before Michelle could stop her. Michelle remained on the steps. You embarrassed me. You brought an agent to my door without asking. It's my door. Valerie took a breath. Then, you won't mind waiting until it's empty. For a moment, something passed across Michelle's face. It was not regret. It was the realization that Valerie might no longer make every difficult thing easier for her. I need a list of what you're taking, Michelle said. I'm making one. I want to see it. I'll give you a copy. Michelle glanced past her into the hall. Her eyes landed on the sewing chest. You're really keeping that? Yes. Fine. She turned and walked to her car. Valerie closed the door and wrote down the time of the visit. That afternoon, she called the craft shop in Meredith. The owner, Nancy Feld, answered on the second ring. Valerie? Hello, Nancy? Oh, honey. Valerie closed her eyes. Nancy had sent a card after the funeral. She had written 3 sentences inside and underlined the one offering help. I need to ask you something practical, Valerie said. Ask. Do you know of a room for rent? There was a short silence. Nancy understood more from that question than Valerie wanted to explain. My sister rents a room above her garage, she said. It's small, the stairs are outside, and the kitchen is hardly a kitchen. How much? I don't know. Let me call her. I can pay something. I'm not asking for charity. I know you're not. And I might need work. We can talk about that too. Valerie looked at the notebook on the table. Not full days at first. Come in tomorrow. We'll have tea, and you can tell me what you can manage. After they hung up, Valerie sat quietly. Calling Nancy had been harder than refusing Michelle. Pride could stand firm at a front door. It had less protection when asking an old friend for a room. Still, the call had been made. The room belonged to Nancy's older sister, Ellen Price, who lived on a side street near the edge of Meredith. The garage stood behind a narrow white house with green shutters. A flight of wooden steps climbed along one outside wall. Valerie tested each step carefully during the viewing. At the top was a single room with a sloped ceiling, a bathroom, and a counter holding a hot plate. The refrigerator was the kind used in offices. A square window looked over the roofs toward a narrow strip of lake. It's not much, Ellen said. It's clean. The heat works. There's a space heater too, but don't run both at once. I won't. There's no laundry. You'd have to use mine on Tuesdays or go into town. Tuesdays are fine. Ellen named a monthly rent Valerie could manage for a little while. It would take most of what remained in her personal account, but Nancy offered her 2 afternoons a week at the shop beginning in April. Valerie paid the first month and took the key. She did not feel rescued. She felt frightened and relieved in equal measure, which was more useful. Over the following days, she packed. She gave Edward's medical supplies to Pamela, who knew a community equipment cupboard that could use them. Pamela came on a rainy morning and stood in the den holding a sealed box of dressings. You're leaving? She asked. Michelle owns the house. Pamela looked at the bare patch where Edward's bed had stood. I didn't know. Neither did I. What did he leave you? Valerie hesitated. Shame had no good reason to be there, but it came anyway. His mother's sewing chest. Pamela turned toward the hall. Rose's chest? You know it? Edward mentioned it once. When? Pamela considered the question. I'm not sure. Near the end? What did he say? He asked whether you still had it. I said I didn't know what he meant. Valerie waited. Was there something else? Pamela's eyes moved toward the den. She seemed to search her memory, then shook her head. He was tired that day. We talked about several things. Did he tell you about the will? Pamela held the box against her coat. That's not a simple question. It has a simple answer. No, he didn't show me a will. That isn't what I asked. Pamela met her eyes. He talked about making sure you had somewhere safe. I assumed he'd arranged it. Valerie looked toward the sewing chest. He didn't. Pamela's grip tightened on the box. Valerie, if you need me, you call. For what? I don't know yet. That answer stayed with Valerie after Pamela drove away. Edward had told the hospice nurse he wanted Valerie somewhere safe. He had told his family attorney something else, or the attorney had a document that did something else. Valerie could not make the two facts sit comfortably together. She wrote the conversation in her notebook. Gary returned twice. The first time, he collected files from the den. The second time, he brought cardboard boxes with the hardware store logo printed on them. "You don't need to keep records of every dish," he said when he saw Valerie's notebook. "I'm keeping records of what I take. Michelle thinks you're treating us like thieves. I haven't taken anything yet. That's not what I said." Valerie folded a sweater and placed it into the suitcase. "Do you want to check the pockets?" Gary's face hardened. "There's no reason to be nasty." She looked at him. He had just told her that documenting her own clothes made his sister feel accused. Somehow, he wanted comfort from the person being removed. Valerie closed the suitcase. "Did your father ever talk to you about Rose's sewing chest?" "No." "Or about Dennis Franklin?" Gary frowned. "Dennis? Not recently. Did they fall out?" "I don't know. Dad stopped seeing a lot of people." "Did Dennis have anything to do with the lake camp?" Gary shrugged. He and Dad built things together, docks, porches, whatever people paid them for. "Did he build the boathouse?" "Maybe. Why?" Valerie kept her voice even. "I found an old photograph." Gary glanced toward the chest, but did not ask to see it. "The camp's probably full of old junk too," he said. "Kevin's checking the tax map. We'll send someone out when the road dries. What if it belongs to someone else? It belonged to Dad. It wasn't in the will. That doesn't mean it isn't part of the estate." He lifted the file box from the desk. "Don't go poking around out there, Valerie. The dock's unsafe, and the floor in the cottage may be rotten." She had not said she planned to go. His warning made her write down the question after he left. Why had Edward not listed the camp? Moving day came on the first Monday in April. Nancy borrowed her sister's station wagon. Ellen brought old blankets for the sewing chest. Gary had promised to help, but called that morning to say a delivery truck had broken down near Tilton. Michelle did not come. The suitcase went into the back seat. Valerie's clothes and dishes filled 6 boxes. The sewing chest took most of the cargo area after Nancy and Valerie removed its trays to lighten it. Before leaving, Valerie walked through the house one final time. She checked the stove, closed the windows, and looked inside every cupboard. In the den, she stood where Edward's bed had been. There was nothing to say there. She placed the house key on the kitchen counter beside the notebook copy of her inventory. Then she added the photograph of every item she had removed. Nancy waited outside without hurrying her. Valerie locked the front door from inside, walked through the garage, and lowered the door by hand. The house disappeared behind its white panels. She left through the side door and pulled it shut. Michelle would have her inspection. There would be no damage to find, no missing silver, no careless excuse to call Valerie dishonest. The drive to Meredith took less than 20 minutes. Valerie sat beside Nancy while the familiar road passed in damp browns and grays. Patches of snow remained beneath the pines. The lake appeared between buildings, cold and flat beneath the April sky. "It'll look better when the leaves come," Nancy said. Valerie knew she meant the room, not the town. "It looks fine now." They carried the boxes upstairs one at a time. Ellen's neighbor, a retired mechanic named Paul Dyer, came over to help with the chest. He and Nancy took the lower end while Valerie guided from above. Inside the room, they placed it beneath the square window. "Solid old thing," Paul said. "Oak?" "Chestnut, I think," Valerie replied. He tapped the side lightly. "Heavier than it ought to be. Everything old is." Paul smiled. "That includes me." When everyone left, Valerie stood in the middle of the room. Her bed was a narrow daybed against the wall. Her suitcase lay across it, still closed. 6 boxes made a row beside the bathroom door. The sewing chest sat under the window with its scratched lid and uneven feet. Rain began tapping the roof. Valerie heated canned soup on the hot plate. She ate from her mother's blue bowl with the notebook open beside her. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote 3 names: Dennis Franklin, Pamela Cunningham, Martin Bell. She drew a line beneath them. Then she wrote, "What did Edward think he had arranged?" The question looked severe in her handwriting. She washed the bowl in the bathroom sink. After drying it, she returned to the chest and unpacked Rose's trays. This time, she wasn't sorting for usefulness. She was paying attention. Pamela remembered Edward asking about the chest. Edward had asked Valerie to bring it downstairs shortly before he died. He had mentioned Dennis when she said she couldn't move it. Those things might mean nothing. Grief could turn ordinary words into clues if a person wanted badly enough. Valerie did not want to fool herself. She examined each tray anyway. The joints were old, but ordinary. The bottom panels were solid. She ran her fingertips along the interior corners and found no false seam. She lifted every folded pattern. Most were for dresses and aprons from decades earlier. One envelope held Rose's handwritten measurements and a grocery receipt dated 2 months before she died. Valerie checked beneath the paper lining. Nothing. Then she began lifting the spools. There were nearly 40 of them. Some held silk thread, some cotton, and several were empty. Valerie arranged them by color across the floor. One dark blue spool felt heavier than the others. She placed it in her left palm and picked up an empty spool of the same size. The difference was slight, but certain. Valerie shook the blue spool beside her ear as something clicked inside. She held it beneath the lamp. The wood looked hand-turned, with shallow grooves near both ends. A round paper label covered the top. The label named a thread company that had closed long before Valerie worked at the craft shop. She pressed her thumbnail against its edge. The paper lifted too easily. Underneath was a thin line circling the center hole, not a crack, a fitted cap. Valerie took Rose's small scissors from the tray and worked one sharp point into the line. The cap resisted, then rose with a soft wooden snap. A brass key slid into her palm. It was no longer than her thumb, with an ornate loop and two narrow teeth darkened by age. Inside the hollow spool remained a tightly rolled piece of paper. Valerie eased it out with the scissors and flattened it on the chest lid. The handwriting was Edward's. "Val, if this has reached you, call Dennis Franklin. Take him to the camp. He'll remember the loon's nest under the boathouse. The key is yours. Don't give it to Gary or Michelle." Valerie read the note twice. Then she locked the room, carried the spool and key to the table, and called Dennis Franklin. Dennis Franklin. His voice was deeper than Valerie remembered. "Dennis, this is Valerie Reeves." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair moving. "Valerie, I'm sorry I didn't call. That's all right. It isn't. I just didn't know what to say." She looked at Edward's note on the table. "I found something with your name on it." Dennis went quiet. In Edward's handwriting, she added, "What did it say?" "That I should call you and take you to the camp." Another silence followed. This one felt different. "Did he leave you a key?" Dennis asked. Valerie closed her hand around it. "How did you know?" "I didn't. Not for sure." "What does it open? Can you meet me tomorrow? At the camp?" "No. Somewhere warm first. There's a diner across from the old lumber yard in Meredith. I know it." 9 o'clock, Valerie agreed. She slept with the brass key on the table beside her bed. Each time a car passed on the wet street below, reflected light moved across the ceiling. Edward had hidden the spool in 2016, unless he had opened the chest and done it later. Valerie could not know that yet. She only knew the note had been folded tightly enough to hold its curve. He had planned for her to find it. That was comforting for less than a minute. Then the other part returned. "Don't give it to Gary or Michelle." Edward had written his own children's names as a warning. Valerie wanted to believe illness had made him suspicious, but the handwriting was steady. The instructions were brief and clear. At 9 the next morning, Dennis was waiting in a rear booth at the diner. His gray hair had grown long around his ears since the funeral. A canvas jacket hung over the seat beside him, and a mug of coffee cooled between his hands. Valerie slid into the booth. "You look tired," he said. "So do you. That saves us both from pretending." A waitress brought Valerie coffee. Dennis waited until she left, then held out his hand. Valerie placed the key in it. He turned it beneath the hanging lamp. His thumb rubbed the ornate loop. "Edward kept it," he said. "You recognize it? I bought the lock." "For what?" "A compartment under the boathouse." Valerie heard dishes strike together in the kitchen. Someone at the counter laughed. The ordinary sounds made Dennis's words seem more believable, not less. "What kind of compartment?" He returned the key. "We built a dry box into the framing. Small one. Rose wanted a safe place for the camp papers." "Why under the boathouse?" "Because Edward didn't trust the cottage roof. That sounded like him." "What's the loon's nest?" Dennis smiled faintly. Rose painted a loon on the panel. Looked more like a black chicken, but nobody told her. "Is the box still there?" "It should be." "What's inside?" "I haven't opened it since we finished the work." "When was that photograph taken?" "What photograph?" Valerie took it from her handbag and slid it across the table. Dennis lifted it carefully. His expression changed when he saw Rose standing on the dock. That was the summer we raised the boathouse, he said. It used to sit lower. Every spring, the floor flooded. You helped Edward build it? Helped him rebuild most of the camp over the years. Gary said you stopped seeing each other. That's mostly true. Why? Dennis looked through the window toward the empty lumber yard. He got private. Edward was always private, more than before. When? Dennis set the photograph down. After the heart trouble. In 2016? You knew about that? I spent 2 nights beside him at the hospital. Right. His answer bothered her. What are you leaving out? I don't know enough to leave anything out. Then tell me what you do know. Dennis wrapped both hands around his mug. After that hospital stay, Edward asked me questions about the camp. Boundaries, old repairs, when the dock went in, things he already knew. Why? He said he was straightening out records. Did he mention me? No. Gary or Michelle? No. Then why did you ask whether he left me a key? Dennis gave the question the time it deserved. Because I saw him remove that lock once. He said it had to be cleaned. A few weeks later, he told me Rose's chest was the safest place in the family. Valerie stared at him. What did you think that meant? I thought it meant he'd put the key there. And you never asked? Edward didn't invite questions. No, he didn't. Dennis pushed the sugar bowl aside. I should have called after he died. Would you have told me this? I don't know. Maybe not without the key. That honesty made her trust him more than an easy promise would have. Can we go today? She asked. The road may be soft. I have boots. I meant for my truck. Does it have 4-wheel drive? It does. Then we can turn around if we need to. Dennis studied her face, then reached for his jacket. All right. They left Valerie's coffee half finished. Dennis's truck was older than Gary's store vehicle and cleaner inside. A carpenter's level rested behind the seat. Work gloves filled the door pocket. He drove north, then turned onto Loon Cove Road, where the pavement narrowed between thick spruce. Winter had not completely released the ground. Snow remained in shaded ditches. Meltwater ran in shallow streams over the gravel. Valerie remembered the turn only when Dennis made it. 2 granite posts marked the entrance, though one had tipped sideways. A chain sagged across the drive. Dennis stopped. That wasn't here before, he said. Is it locked? He climbed out and brushed pine needles from the clasp. The padlock hung open. Someone's been keeping vehicles out. Gary? Could be the town. Could be Edward. They lowered the chain and drove through. Branches scraped both sides of the truck. A fallen birch blocked the drive 50 yards in, its white trunk resting against a young pine. Dennis shut off the engine. We walk from here. Valerie looked past the windshield. The land sloped toward the lake, but the cottage remained hidden. Dennis took a bow saw from behind the seat. I thought we were walking. We are. I want to see if this is solid enough to cut on the way back. He pressed one boot against the trunk, tested its weight, then left it alone. Valerie followed him along the drive. The ground gave softly beneath her boots. She placed each step where he did. After several minutes, the trees opened. The cottage stood among them. Its shingles had faded to uneven gray. Green moss spread along the lower roof. One shutter hung from a single hinge, and the porch steps leaned toward the lake. The view behind it stopped Valerie. Lake Winnipesaukee stretched beyond the trees, cold blue under a pale sky. The shoreline curved around Loon Cove. Across the water, wooded hills rose through a thin morning haze. No neighboring house was visible from the porch. Worthless teardown, Valerie said. Dennis looked at her. Who called it that? Gary. He hasn't been out here in years. Is he wrong about the cottage needing work? No. Dennis crossed the clearing and pressed his palm against a porch post. He tested the first step before letting Valerie use it. The front door was secured by a rusted hasp, but no lock. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood and mouse droppings. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sagging sofa, and a pine table covered by a plastic sheet. 2 doors led to small bedrooms. A narrow kitchen ran along the back wall. Valerie opened a curtain. Dust rose in the light. Water had stained one corner of the ceiling. A section of plaster had fallen onto the floor, exposing dark boards above. Dennis removed his cap. That leak's active. How can you tell? Edges are damp. He went outside again. Valerie followed him around the cottage until he found the cause. A heavy limb had struck the rear roof and cracked several shingles. Meltwater ran beneath them. "If it rains hard, it'll get into the wall," he said. "The forecast said rain tonight." "I know." "What do we need?" Dennis looked toward the block drive. "A ladder, roofing felt, a tarp, and younger knees." "You have 3 of those." "I've got felt at home. Ladder too. I have knees. Questionable ones. They got me here." He smiled despite himself. They continued toward the shore. The dock had lifted on one side, where ice pushed against its posts. The boathouse stood farther along, joined to land by a narrow walkway. Its siding had silvered with age. One corner dipped slightly toward the water. Dennis stopped Valerie before she stepped onto the boards. "Let me go first." He tested each plank with the handle of his saw. The third one gave a soft crack. "That's enough for today," he said. "The compartment is under there. So is the lake. We came for the lock. We came to see whether the building would hold us." He crouched near the shore and examined the support beams. Valerie looked across the water. "Can we reach it from underneath? Not without a boat, and the water's cold enough to stop your heart. There must be another way. There will be after I brace the walkway." "How long?" "A day if the framing underneath is sound. And if it isn't, longer." She could see the boathouse door shifting slightly in the wind. Edward's note had brought her within 20 feet of whatever he'd hidden, but the last distance was unsafe. Dennis rose carefully. "We need to cover that roof first." "The cottage roof? It won't matter what's under the boathouse if this place rots around it." Valerie understood the sense of that. She disliked it anyway. They returned to the drive. Dennis cut the fallen birch into 3 sections, while Valerie pulled away the smaller branches. The saw work left him breathing hard. When she told him to rest, he said he had been about to tell her the same thing. They sat on the tailgate and shared a bottle of water. "Why didn't Edward come here?" Valerie asked. Dennis wiped his forehead with a folded handkerchief. After his heart scare, he said the road was too rough. Later, his knees bothered him. He could have asked for help. He didn't like asking. He asked me for help every day. At the end, he had no choice. Valerie looked back toward the hidden cottage. He had choices before that. Dennis capped the water bottle. "Yes." They drove to his house for the ladder and supplies, then returned before noon. By then, clouds had gathered above the lake. Dennis climbed onto the rear roof while Valerie steadied the ladder. He pulled the broken shingles free, covered the damaged section with felt, then secured a tarp over it. He worked slowly. Valerie respected that. A person could be experienced and still fall. When he came down, mud streaked both knees of his trousers. "That will hold through tonight. I'll pay you for the supplies." "No." "Dennis, Edward helped frame my house. I never paid him for every nail. This isn't his house." Dennis looked at her. "Maybe not," he said. "But he sent you." They aired the cottage by opening every window that still moved. Valerie swept plaster from the main room and carried it out in a metal dustpan. Dennis shut off an old breaker box and checked beneath the kitchen sink. A pipe had split along one seam. "No water until that's replaced," he said. "Is the well good?" "Don't know." "Heat?" "Fireplace?" "There used to be 2 electric baseboards, but I wouldn't trust that wiring." Valerie made a list on the back page of her notebook. Roof, pipe, well, electricity, walkway. Dennis glanced over her shoulder. "You planning to move in?" "I'm planning to know what's wrong." "That's a better answer." They left shortly before the rain started. At Ellen's house, Valerie helped Dennis cover the sewing chest with a blanket before he carried it upstairs. She had taken it to the camp because the note told her to take Dennis, not the chest, but she had not wanted to leave the key behind. Once it was safely inside, Dennis handed the key back. "Keep that hidden." "I know. Don't put it in the spool again." "Why not? If somebody knows about the chest, that's where they'll look." "Nobody knows?" "Edward knew, I guessed." Gary and Michelle thought it was rubbish. Dennis rested one hand on the stair rail. "Let them keep thinking that." He left before dark. Rain drummed against the roof through the evening. Valerie called Nancy and said she would not be available for work the next morning. Then she placed the key inside an empty packet of sewing needles and tucked it among her clothing. At 8:30, her phone rang. Gary's name appeared on the screen. Valerie answered. "Were you at Loon Cove today?" he asked. There was no greeting. "Yes." "With Dennis Franklin?" "Yes." "What were you doing?" "Looking at the cottage." "Why?" Valerie sat at the small table. I wanted to see it. You don't have permission to go onto estate property. The chain wasn't locked. That isn't permission. Who told you I was there? Someone saw Dennis's truck. The nearest road had seemed empty, but spring exposed houses and driveways hidden in summer. Gary continued before she could answer. Kevin is arranging an assessment. We can't have people making changes. The roof was leaking. What? A branch broke the shingles. Dennis covered the opening before the rain. Gary went quiet. Did you authorize him to do that? He asked. I held the ladder. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Keeping rain out? You're interfering with property that doesn't belong to you. Valerie looked at Edward's note beside the lamp. Martin said the title needed review. And until that review is finished, it's an estate asset. Has he finished it? We're handling it. That isn't an answer. Gary exhaled hard. The cottage is unsafe. The whole place might be worth $60,000 on a generous day, and most of that is land. We need to sell it without pouring money into repairs. How much are the taxes? What? On Loon Cove. I don't know offhand. Who has been paying them? The store, maybe? Dad had automatic payments. Whose name is on the bill? Why are you asking me this? Because you say the property belongs to the estate, but you don't know how it was held. I know it was Dad's. Valerie unfolded Edward's note and read the warning again. Then have Martin show you the deed. Gary's voice became colder. Stay away from the camp until we sort this out. Are you locking the chain? If I have to. The roof still needs a proper repair. We'll decide what it needs. You didn't know it was leaking. I know now. And the walkway to the boathouse is rotten. Then you had no business walking on it. I didn't. Gary paused. What were you doing near the boathouse? Valerie held the phone tighter. Looking at the condition of the property. Why the boathouse specifically? Through the rain, she could hear water running from Ellen's gutters. It's part of the property, isn't it? Gary did not answer immediately. He had heard something guarded in her voice. Valerie heard his suspicion form in the silence. Did Dad tell you something about that place? He asked. Valerie folded the note once. He told me very little about anything. That's not what I asked. No, she said. It isn't. She ended the call, turned off the lamp, and sat listening to the rain strike the roof Edward had not left her. By morning, the rain had eased to a steady drip from the eaves. A message from Gary waited on her phone. Do not return to Loon Cove. Appraiser scheduled. Martin reviewing title. Valerie copied the message into her notebook, including the time. Then she called Martin's office. He came to the phone after his assistant placed her on hold twice. I understand you're reviewing the Loon Cove title, Valerie said. Yes. There are some old records involved. Whose name is on it? I can't answer that until I've completed the review. Can you tell me whether Gary has authority to keep me off the property? Martin hesitated. Gary is handling estate administration. That isn't what I asked. The prudent thing would be to avoid the property until ownership is clear. Is Gary the executor? Yes. Does that give him authority over property that might not belong to the estate? Martin's voice became more formal. Valerie, I can't give you independent legal advice. This office represents the estate. You read me the will? I explained the estate documents. You didn't explain that you weren't representing me. I'm explaining it now. Valerie held the phone away from her ear for a moment. She had known Martin for years. He sent Christmas cards with a photograph of his 2 golden retrievers. Edward had taken him fishing once. Now, he was not rude, not unkind, and not hers. Has Gary told you I found something? She asked. Found what? That answers my question. Valerie, I'll wait for your title review. She hung up before he could tell her again to be prudent. At the craft shop, Nancy gave her a drawer near the cutting table and the same yellow measuring tape she had used before Edward became ill. Nothing had moved far. Batting stood in tall rolls along the back wall. Sample quilts hung from wooden rods. The register still stuck when the weather was damp. Valerie spent the afternoon cutting fabric for a woman making curtains. The work required straight edges, accurate numbers, and no discussion of death. Her hands remembered it. Near closing time, Nancy placed a torn canvas bag on the counter. Can this be saved? Valerie examined the split seam. Yes. I was hoping you'd say that. It won't be pretty. It carries library books. They don't care. Valerie took the bag upstairs that evening, Rose's black-handled scissors cut through a strip of heavy fabric without catching. Valerie repaired the seam by hand, then reinforced both handles. She earned $12 for that repair. Nancy tried to make it 20. Valerie refused the extra 8 and accepted another bag instead. Small work was still work. 4 days passed before the ground dried enough for Dennis to call. "I've got lumber for the walkway," he said. "Not new. Sound. Can we go tomorrow? Gary told you not to. He isn't sure it belongs to him. Neither are you. That's why we need to open the box." Dennis made a low sound that was neither agreement nor refusal. "Did Edward ever give you permission to enter the camp?" Valerie asked. "He gave me a key to the gate years ago. There was no locked gate then. The old chain had a lock. This is a newer chain. Did he ever take permission away?" "No." "Then you're going to inspect work you helped build." "I'm going because my husband directed me there in writing." "You've been thinking about this." "Yes." "Bring the note. I'll bring a copy." Dennis approved of that. They left early the next morning. The sky was clear, though the air still carried winter along the shaded road. The chain at the drive now held a closed padlock. Dennis stopped the truck on the shoulder. "He did it," Valerie said. "Looks that way." A paper sign had been wired to the chain. "Private property. Entry by authorization only." Below that, someone had written Reeves Estate in black marker. Valerie photographed the chain and sign. "What now?" Dennis asked. "Can we walk in without damaging anything?" "Yes." "Then we walk." Dennis parked where the truck would not block the road. They carried the lumber around the granite post, one board at a time. Valerie's shoulders began aching before the third trip. Dennis wanted to carry 2 boards himself. She told him he was 70 and no longer required to prove anything with his spine. He told her 62 was not the first morning of spring either. They carried one each. At the cottage, the temporary roof covering remained tight. Inside, the air smelled less stale. The open windows from their previous visit had allowed the dampness to escape before Dennis closed them. Valerie set her copy of Edward's note on the pine table. Dennis read it slowly. "He knew they might take the chest," he said. "He knew they wouldn't want it, that too. Why did he hide the key instead of giving it to me?" Dennis folded the paper along its existing crease. "Maybe he was afraid you'd ask questions while he was alive. That isn't a good reason." "No. Maybe he didn't trust me." Dennis looked at her. "He trusted you with himself when he couldn't stand up. That's different. It's bigger." Valerie took the note from him. She was not ready to let Edward's decision become tender simply because he was dead. A hidden key was still a hidden key. A warning was still something he had left her to understand alone. They carried the boards toward the boathouse. The walkway was about 12 feet long and narrow enough that Valerie could touch the railing on either side. Dennis lay flat near the shore and reached beneath the first section. "Main supports are solid," he said. "Cross pieces aren't. Can you replace them from above?" "Most of them." He marked weak boards with white chalk. Then he removed the first plank and passed it back to Valerie. They worked through the morning. Dennis handled the pry bar and drill. Valerie measured replacement boards and held each one steady while he cut. When he knelt too long, she brought him the overturned bucket from the cottage. When her fingers stiffened, he made coffee on a small propane stove. By noon, they had replaced 4 planks and reinforced 2 others. Dennis walked the length first. He bounced once on each section, ignoring Valerie's request that he not do that. "It'll hold," he said. "Both of us?" "One at a time." The boathouse door had swollen in its frame. Dennis pressed his shoulder against it while lifting the latch. The bottom dragged across the floor, then opened. Sunlight entered through gaps in the siding. An old aluminum rowboat hung upside down from ceiling straps. Coiled rope covered one wall. A wooden workbench stood at the back beneath a row of empty shelves. The lake moved below them. Narrow lines of light showed between the floorboards. Valerie stopped just inside. "Where is it?" Dennis looked around. The boathouse was familiar to him in pieces. He remembered building the workbench, replacing the roof, and helping Rose paint the walls. But time had changed surfaces. Shelves had been moved, boards had darkened. He walked to the far wall and crouched. It should be under this end. Valerie joined him. 3 wide floorboards ran beneath the workbench. Each appeared fixed in place. Dennis swept away dirt and dried leaves with his glove. Nothing showed. "Are you sure?" Valerie asked. "I cut the opening myself. Could Edward have covered it?" "He could have." Dennis ran his hand beneath the lower shelf. His fingers stopped. There. He lifted a loose strip of wood no wider than a ruler. Behind it, faded paint showed on the wall panel. Valerie could make out an oval body, a narrow beak, and one crooked red eye. Rose's loon did look like a black chicken. "The nest," she said. Dennis smiled. Nobody accused us of being clever. Beneath the painted bird were two small screws. Dennis removed them. The panel shifted but did not open. "Key first," he said. "There's no keyhole. Not on the face." He pressed the painted loon inward. A narrow section of the floor rose half an inch. Valerie saw a brass keyhole set into the edge. She took the needle packet from her handbag and removed the key. For a moment, she did not insert it. If it failed, Edward's note might lead nowhere. If it worked, then he had hidden more than a private memory. Dennis waited beside her. Valerie slid the key into the lock. It fit. The mechanism resisted when she turned it. Dennis placed 2 fingers on the raised board and pulled upward while she held the key steady. A dull click came from beneath the floor. Together, they lifted the section. The cavity below was lined with galvanized metal. It was deeper than Valerie expected, and nearly the width of the workbench. Inside sat a green steel lockbox wrapped in a waxed cloth. No money surrounded it. No jewelry caught the light. There was only the box, dry and undisturbed. Dennis lifted it onto the floor. Its brass lock matched the key. Valerie turned it again. Inside were paper envelopes, a small leather notebook, and a folded letter bearing her name. She recognized Edward's handwriting before she touched it. The first envelope contained old property tax receipts. Most were dated before their marriage. The second held photographs of repair work, dock permits, and handwritten measurements. Beneath them lay part of an old deed. The page had separated along a fold. Its upper section was missing, but the remaining paper carried a legal description of land along Loon Cove Road. The words were difficult to follow. Names of boundary markers and distances ran through the paragraph. Near the bottom was a county recording stamp. A pencil note in Edward's hand appeared along one edge. "Original parcel. Take to Louis with my letter." "Louis who?" Valerie asked. Dennis had gone still. "Open the letter." Valerie unfolded it. The date at the top was the 23rd of June, 2016. "Val, if you are reading this, the papers I arranged did not reach you in the ordinary way. Loon Cove was handled separately from the rest. Louis McDonald prepared and recorded what was needed after my hospital stay. The camp should not be sold with the store or Pine Grove. Take this letter, the deed page, and the key to Louis. He will know what I signed and where the full record is kept. Do not surrender these originals to the estate attorney. Make copies first. I should have told you plainly. I kept waiting for a better time, which is an excuse and not a reason." Edward Valerie reached the bottom and kept looking at the page. The camp should not be sold with the store or Pine Grove. Dennis read over her shoulder. He did not speak. Valerie read it again, slower. "What did he sign?" she asked. "I don't know." "Who is Louis McDonald? He handled some building contracts for us years ago. Then he became an estate attorney. Was he Edward's attorney, not the one the family used? Do you know where he works? He had an office near Guilford. I don't know if he still does." Valerie lifted the old deed fragment. The paper trembled slightly in her hand. She placed it flat before she damaged it. Edward had separated the lake camp from something. That was all the letter clearly proved. It did not say Valerie owned it. It did not explain what had been recorded, or why no one at the will meeting mentioned it. Still, Gary's certainty no longer had the same weight. He had locked a chain around land Edward said should not be sold with the estate. Dennis opened the leather notebook. Most pages recorded repairs and materials. Near the back, Edward had written a telephone number beside Lewis's name. Valerie tried it from the boathouse. A recorded voice said the number was no longer in service. She looked toward the cottage. "Do you have a phone book?" "Not from this century." They repacked the box, leaving the repair photographs and old receipts inside. Valerie took the letter, deed fragment, and leather notebook. Dennis locked the cavity and replaced the panel. As they crossed the repaired walkway, a vehicle moved slowly along Loon Cove Road beyond the trees. It stopped near Dennis's truck, waited, then continued. Neither could see who was driving. They carried their tools out by hand. The chain remained locked. Back at Ellen's, Valerie copied every page. Nancy let her use the machine in the craft shop office. Valerie placed the originals in a large envelope and stored it beneath the removable lining of the sewing chest. Then she searched for Louis McDonald. His old firm had closed, but a state directory listed him at a small independent office in Guilford. The number differed from the one in Edward's notebook. A woman answered, "McDonald Legal. I need to speak with Louis McDonald about a document he prepared for my husband." "Is your husband a current client?" "He died in February." "I'm sorry. What was his name?" "Edward Reeves." The woman stopped typing. "Would you hold, please?" Louis came to the phone less than a minute later. "This is Louis McDonald. My name is Valerie Reeves. I know who you are." She tightened her grip on the receiver. "I found a letter telling me to contact you." "Where did you find it?" "In a box at Loon Cove." Louis breathed out slowly. "Do you have the key?" "Yes." "And part of the old deed?" "Yes." "Don't give either one to Martin Bell." Edward wrote the same thing. "Has Martin contacted you about the lake property?" "He told me his office represents the estate." "Good. Remember that." Valerie looked toward the closed shop door. "What did Edward sign in 2016? Louis did not answer immediately. "I need to retrieve the archived file," he said. "Come to my office Monday morning. Bring Edward's letter and the deed page. Until then, keep the originals somewhere Gary and Michelle cannot reach them." Valerie returned the envelope beneath the chest lining and kept the key in her handbag. On Monday, Dennis drove her to Guilford. He offered to come inside, but she told him to wait until she knew what Louis intended to say. The office occupied the second floor of a converted house. The front room held 2 desks, a copier, and several shelves crowded with binders. Nothing about it resembled Martin's polished conference room. Louis met her at the door. He was a thin man with silver beginning at his temples. He wore no jacket, and his blue shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows. "I'm glad you called," he said. Valerie gave him Edward's letter and the deed fragment. Louis read the letter standing up. He stopped at the final paragraph, then read it again. "He always believed he had more time," he said. "To tell me, to finish difficult conversations. That sounds kinder than avoiding them." Louis placed the letter on his desk. "It may be both." He opened a gray archive box. Inside were file folders labeled with dates and property names. He removed one marked Loon Cove Property Trust. Valerie sat across from him. What exactly did Edward do? In June of 2016, he created an irrevocable trust for the Loon Cove property. He transferred the property into that trust and named you as its sole beneficiary. Valerie looked at the folder. "You're saying the camp is mine?" "I'm saying it should not be part of Edward's probate estate. It was transferred almost 10 years before his death. Why does Martin not know that? He may know by now. The document was recorded. Then why wasn't it mentioned at the will meeting? Because a will controls what someone owns at death. Edward did not personally own Loon Cove when he died. The trust did. And I own the trust. You're its sole beneficiary. Under the terms Edward signed, control passes for your benefit after his death." Valerie tried to fit the explanation beside the meeting in Laconia. Gary had received the store. Michelle had received the house. Everyone had spoken of the camp as an overlooked estate property. Who controlled it before Edward died? Edward managed it as trustee. You became successor trustee upon his death. Without knowing? That is the part I wish he had handled differently. Louis opened the folder and removed a clean office copy. The last page had no signatures. "This is the final draft from our file. The signed original went for recording with the property transfer. My archived executed copy is missing from this box." Missing? The office moved twice after I left my old firm. Several files were divided between storage companies. I've requested the remaining cartons, so you can't prove he signed it. The registry should have the recorded instruments. That copy matters more than mine. Should? Louis leaned forward. I remember the signing. I remember walking the documents to the recording counter. But in a dispute, memory is not what I want you relying on. Was Edward ill? He'd had a heart scare. He was tired and frightened. He was also fully aware of what he was doing. Why did he make it irrevocable? He did not want the property pulled back into the rest of his planning later. He said the store and the family home were tied to obligations involving Gary and Michelle. Loon Cove was to remain separate. For me, yes. Valerie touched the edge of the unsigned copy. Did he tell you why he wouldn't tell me? He said you would object to having a home, to anything that might seem taken from his children. She almost laughed, but there was nothing amusing in it. He knew me well enough to hide a house from me. He knew you would try to keep peace. And what did keeping peace get me? Lewis did not answer. She turned to the property description. Could Edward change this later? Not by simply changing his will. That was the point. Could Gary? No. Could Michelle? No. Could Martin? Not if the trust was properly executed and recorded. If. Louis closed the folder. We'll go to the registry tomorrow. Why not today? Because I want the book and page references from my old billing records first. It will save time. Valerie stood. Does Martin have the same records? He can search the public index without them. Then he may already know. Yes. Dennis was waiting in the truck with 2 coffees. Valerie carried hers untouched while she explained. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked through the windshield toward the road. Edward gave you the camp, not in the will. Before the will mattered. So Louis says, you don't believe him? I believe he remembers. I want the paper. Dennis nodded. That sounds sensible. Gary locked me out of property that may already be mine. That sounds like Gary. He may not have known. Dennis considered it. That also sounds like Gary. Valerie turned toward him. What does that mean? He decides what's true based on what he needs. Did he learn that from Edward? Some of it. She looked down at the coffee lid. Did Edward know the store was in trouble? Edward always knew when the store was in trouble. How much trouble? Dennis shook his head. You'd have to ask Gary. Valerie did not have to wait long. Michelle called that afternoon and asked her to come to Pine Grove Lane. She said they needed to discuss the lake property together. Valerie nearly refused. Then she asked who would be present. Gary and Kevin. Martin? No. Then it isn't an estate meeting. It's a family conversation. Valerie looked around the rented room. The phrase had once meant Thanksgiving plans, or who would drive Edward to an appointment. I'll come at 6, she said. Dennis offered to take her. Valerie accepted the ride, but asked him to wait outside. Michelle opened the side door before Valerie knocked. The kitchen looked unchanged except for the absence of Valerie's blue bowl. Michelle had placed a bowl of green apples on the table. Valerie knew they were decorative because everyone still carried a grocery sticker. Gary sat where Edward used to sit. Kevin had spread papers across Valerie's former place. No one offered coffee. Michelle began. Gary says you found documents at the camp. I found personal papers from Edward about the property, Kevin asked. Yes, we need to see them. Why? Because Gary is executor. They may concern property outside the estate. Gary looked at Michelle. That brief glance told Valerie they had heard something. Perhaps Martin's title search had reached the same year Lewis mentioned. Perhaps the lock chain had not created the control Gary expected. What did MacDonald tell you? Gary asked. Valerie sat down slowly. You knew I saw him? Martin found a reference to his firm. A reference to what? Kevin straightened the papers. We can stop circling. There may have been an old trust document. We don't know whether it was completed, replaced, or valid. Martin didn't mention it at the reading. He didn't have it then, Michelle said. Edward's letter says the property was handled separately. Gary leaned forward. We need the letter. No, it's Dad's letter. It's addressed to me. He was talking about estate property. You don't know that. Gary pressed his palm against the table. This is not a game, Valerie. I know. Games are supposed to be enjoyable. Michelle sighed. Can we please speak normally? I am speaking normally. Kevin rotated a printed page toward Valerie. It showed columns of figures, account names, and payment dates. The store has a serious cash problem, he said. Gary looked away. How serious? Valerie asked. Kevin tapped the bottom line. About $180,000 in outstanding debt, depending on this month's receipts. Valerie read the figure twice. Does that include the building mortgage? No. Supplier balances, a business credit line, equipment payments, and overdue state taxes. Gary spoke quickly. The taxes are on a payment plan, which you missed in February, Kevin said. My father was dying in February, and the store was losing money before February. Michelle touched Kevin's arm. That's enough. No, Valerie said. Let him finish. Kevin had wanted someone to ask. Numbers were easier for him than blame. Edward had been covering shortages from the business accounts and some personal savings, he said. Not all at once, but regularly. The checking balance Gary inherited is much lower than expected. How much lower? Gary's chair scraped. This is none of your business. You brought me here. Because you're holding documents we need. Why do you need them? Kevin answered. The remaining estate savings won't stabilize the store. Selling the camp was supposed to reduce the debt enough for the bank to extend the credit line. For $60,000, that was the rough land estimate after demolition costs. And if it brought less, we would make other arrangements. Valerie looked at Michelle. Using this house? Michelle's fingers tightened around one another. Kevin suggested a temporary line against it, she said. Only if necessary, and you don't want that, would you? No. Michelle looked relieved, as if Valerie had agreed with more than the question. Gary pushed the paper away. Dad built that store. 40 years of his life are in it. We're trying to keep it open. With money from the camp, with family assets. Valerie heard the phrase clearly. The store was a family asset. The house was a family asset. The savings were family assets. But when Valerie needed somewhere to live, the family had become Gary and Michelle alone. Why didn't anyone tell me this at the will reading? She asked. Because it wasn't your burden, Michelle said. It became my burden when you gave me 30 days to leave. Michelle's face changed. The house was left to us. We didn't write the will. You didn't give me 30 days because you needed to move in. You wanted it empty so Kevin could borrow against it. We hadn't decided that. You had discussed it. Kevin folded his hands. We were considering every option, except giving Gary the house and letting me remain here. That wouldn't solve the store's problem, Michelle said. There it was. The arrangement had never been only about honoring Edward's wishes. Every useful asset had been placed where it could support the store, protect Michelle, or keep Kevin's calculations tidy. Valerie's housing had no value in that calculation. Gary stood and walked to the sink. You had years with Dad, he said. Valerie watched his reflection in the dark window. So did you. Not the same years. No, I had the years when he couldn't eat, sleep, walk upstairs, or use the bathroom alone. Gary turned. Nobody asked you to do all that by yourself. You did every time you stayed away. The room went quiet. Michelle pulled one apple from the bowl and peeled away its sticker with her thumbnail. We thought Dad would provide for you somehow, she said. But when he didn't, you decided that was acceptable. He made his choices. And now you're asking me to ignore one. Michelle placed the apple back. Gary returned to the table. His anger had thinned into urgency. If there's a trust, we need to know what it says. The bank is reviewing the store's credit at the end of June. I can't wait all summer while you and some old lawyer search boxes. Louis isn't searching boxes. He's checking the registry. Kevin looked sharply at Gary. Valerie stood. You knew the store owed money. You knew the camp sale was part of your plan. You still called it worthless when you told me to stay away. It is worthless compared to what the store needs, Gary said. Then you won't miss it. That isn't the point. It is from where I'm standing. She walked toward the side door. Michelle followed her into the hall. Valerie, wait. Valerie stopped but did not turn. If the document is valid, Michelle said, we'll have to deal with that. But please understand what this could do to Gary. Valerie faced her. I understand what all of you already did to me. Dennis's truck waited at the curb with its lights on. Valerie stepped outside, closed the door behind her, and carried the full reason for their hurry with her toward the registry appointment. The appointment fell on the first Tuesday in June. Louis met Valerie and Dennis outside the Belknap County Registry of Deeds shortly after it opened. He carried his archive folder under one arm and a yellow page covered with book and page numbers. Inside, fluorescent lights shone over long counters and public computer terminals. Louis signed them in, then led Valerie to a records clerk. We need the Loon Cove instruments recorded on June 23, 2016, he said. The clerk entered the first number. A scanned document appeared on the monitor. At the top were the words, Warranty Deed. Below them, Edward's name appeared as the person transferring the land. The new owner was listed as Edward Reeves, trustee of the Loon Cove Property Trust. Valerie leaned closer. That proves he moved it? It proves the trust received title, Louis said. Now we need the trust document. The clerk opened the next record. Valerie saw Edward's signature at the bottom before she understood anything else. It was stronger than the handwriting from his final months, with the firm downward stroke he used on checks. A notary's seal appeared beside it. The document was 14 pages. Louis moved through them slowly, showing Valerie the sections that mattered. The trust was irrevocable. The property on Loon Cove Road was its only asset. Valerie Ann Reeves was its sole beneficiary. Edward would manage the property while he lived. Upon his death, Valerie would become successor trustee with full authority to occupy, maintain, lease, or sell it for her own benefit. Gary and Michelle were named once, in a paragraph stating they held no beneficial interest in the trust property. Valerie touched the edge of the counter. They were specifically excluded. From this property, Louis said, not from his estate. Why would he write their names? So nobody could argue he forgot them. Dennis stood on Valerie's other side, reading quietly. The signing date was nearly 10 years before Edward's death. 2 witnesses had signed. The notary had recorded Edward's identification and stated that he had appeared voluntarily. The final page carried the registry stamp: book, page, date, and time. Louis pointed to the line. This is the public record. It has been here since 2016. Then Martin could have found it before the will meeting. He could have searched the parcel. Did he have a duty to? To the estate, yes. Whether he searched before that meeting is something only he can answer. The clerk printed certified copies. Each page received a raised seal. Valerie watched the stack grow beside the printer. The papers did not look like a home. They looked like forms produced by an office machine. Yet those ordinary pages placed a boundary around something everyone else had already begun dividing. The clerk handed the copies to Louis. Keep one set somewhere secure, he told Valerie. Not in your room and not at the camp. Where? A bank box would be sensible. I'll also keep a certified set. What happens now? We file proof of Edward's death and a certificate showing that you are successor trustee. That puts your authority in the current title record. Does Gary have to agree? No. Does Martin? No. Valerie looked at Edward's signature again. Can they challenge it? People can challenge almost anything. Winning is different. What would they claim? Lack of capacity, improper signing, pressure from you, or that another document replaced this one? I didn't know it existed. That makes pressure from you difficult to argue. And did another document replace it? An irrevocable trust cannot be casually undone. There is no later transfer in the registry. Louis separated one certified copy from the others. Edward did what he hired me to do. They spent the next hour preparing the certificate. Valerie signed before a notary. Louis attached Edward's death certificate and recorded the packet that morning. When they walked outside, Dennis stopped beside the courthouse steps. Well, he asked. Valerie held the folder against her chest. Well, what? You've barely said a word. I'm trying to understand how I could own a place for nearly 10 years without knowing. You had the benefit. Edward held the responsibility while he lived. I had neither. I had no idea. Dennis looked toward the parking lot. That part was wrong. Valerie appreciated that he did not try to soften it. Louis joined them with a receipt from the recording counter. This is your current book and page reference, he said. Carry a copy when you go to the property. Gary locked the entrance. He has no right to keep it locked against you. Photograph everything before removing his chain. Don't damage the lock if you can avoid it. Should I tell him first? I'll notify Martin in writing after the new filing appears in the index. You don't need to argue with Gary at the gate. Will the letter say what the property is worth? No. Ownership first. Value is a separate question. As far as Valerie knew, Gary's estimate of $60,000 might be close. The cottage needed a roof, plumbing, wiring, and structural work. The boathouse needed bracing. Even with the lake behind it, repairs could consume more money than she possessed. Still, $60,000 was not nothing. More important, no one could give her 30 days to leave. Dennis drove her to the camp that afternoon. The chain remained locked across the entrance. Valerie photographed the sign, padlock, granite posts, and road. Dennis examined the metal loop attached to the upright post. Bolted through, he said. I can remove the bracket without cutting anything. Do it. He took a socket wrench from the truck. Valerie held the loose end of the chain while he removed 2 nuts. They laid Gary's chain beside the granite post and replaced it with a new one Dennis had brought. Valerie closed her own padlock. The small key came with 2 copies. She gave one to Dennis. You sure? He asked. You know how to keep a roof from leaking. That's not the same as trusting me with your property. No, it's one reason for it. They drove to the cottage. The first thing Valerie did was unlock every window. The second was place a certified trust copy in a plastic sleeve on the kitchen counter while they worked. Dennis replaced the split pipe beneath the sink. Valerie cleared mouse nests from the bedroom cupboards and washed the shelves with hot water carried in containers. They still had no working well. Dennis planned to test the pump after an electrician checked the power. Near sunset, they sat on the porch steps eating sandwiches Nancy had packed. "Would you live here?" Dennis asked. Valerie looked at the roofline. "I don't know whether I can afford to." "You could sell." "I know. Edward gave you that choice too. He gave me papers. The cottage will need money before it gives me anything." Dennis finished his sandwich. "The land gives you something while you're sitting on it. A view, frontage." "How much frontage?" "More than most lots along this cove." Valerie took out the old deed fragment. The boundary description meant little to her, but Dennis traced it with one finger. "It starts beyond that point," he said. "Runs past the boathouse and around the curve." "How far?" "Over 300 feet, unless I remember wrong. Gary called it a $60,000 teardown. He was looking at the building. So was I." 3 days later, a letter arrived at Ellen's house. The return address belonged to Snyder Lake Development. Valerie almost placed it with the advertising mail. Then she saw Loon Cove Road typed beneath her name. Inside was a short note asking her to call Howard Snyder regarding the property's current market value. She called Lewis first. "The successor certificate is public," he said. "Anyone watching land records can see the ownership change." "Why would someone watch this property?" "Because undeveloped lake frontage is scarce." "Should I call him?" "You can listen. Don't sign anything." Howard answered his own phone. "Mrs. Reeves, thank you for calling. How did you find my address?" "Your certificate lists it. What do you want?" "To purchase Loon Cove." "It isn't for sale." "I understand. I'd still like to give you information you may not have." "What information?" "The parcel is larger than the old tax description suggests. I've been buying frontage in that area for several years. Yours connects 2 sections I already control." Valerie stood beside the sewing chest. "How much do you think it's worth?" "I don't make serious offers without seeing current conditions. If you allow access, I'll pay for an appraisal. You receive a full copy, whether you sell or not." "And what do you receive?" "A chance to make the first offer." Valerie asked Louis to review the proposed access agreement. He removed a paragraph granting Snyder's company an exclusive negotiation period. Howard accepted the change without complaint. He visited the following week. Valerie required Dennis to be present. Howard arrived in a dark sport utility vehicle and wore mud-ready boots. He did not spend much time inside the cottage. He walked the shoreline, photographed boundary pins, studied the access road, and measured distances from the water. At the boathouse, he looked across the cove for a long while. "You could put 3 houses here under old zoning," he said. "I don't want 3 houses. A buyer might." "What do you want?" "1 home near the point, with the remainder held for access and privacy." Dennis folded his arms. "Meaning the cottage comes down." Howard glanced back at it. Most buyers would remove it. Valerie watched his face. He was not insulting the building. He simply could not see a reason to keep it. Edward had once made the same mistake about Rose's chest. He had valued what it could hold, not what it already was. The appraisal took 9 days. Howard delivered it in person, along with a purchase proposal in a separate envelope. Valerie opened the appraisal first. The final opinion of market value was $1,400,000. She assumed she had misread it. "This is for the whole cove?" she asked. "For your parcel. The cottage has no water. The value is primarily the land. There are over 300 feet of frontage, deep water access near the boathouse, and enough acreage for privacy. Recent sales support the number." Dennis read over her shoulder. Howard placed the purchase proposal on the table. "My offer is lower because I'd take the property as it stands and close quickly." "How much lower?" $1,250,000. Valerie sat down. For weeks, every decision had been shaped by scarcity. Rent, groceries, bus fare, roof felt, pipe fittings. Now, a man she had met twice was offering more money than she had earned in her entire working life. Howard mistook her silence for hesitation about the figure. "I can leave both documents," he said. "Have your attorney review everything?" "I will. There's no pressure from me. That usually means pressure is coming from somewhere else." Howard gave a small, honest smile. Lake property attracts attention. After he left, Dennis closed the door. What are you going to do? Valerie looked through the window toward the boathouse. I'm going to verify that number. Louis arranged a second market review using comparable sales. It came back within the same range. Valerie placed Howard's appraisal, the certified trust, Edward's letter, and the second review inside a bank box in Meredith. Louis kept copies. Dennis kept none. She did not call Gary or Michelle. For the first time since Edward died, Valerie knew exactly what she held, and she intended to understand who came looking before she showed it to anyone. The first person who came looking was Michelle. She arrived at the craft shop near closing and waited beside the display of quilting rulers. Nancy glanced between them, then took a box of receipts into the back room. Michelle placed a document on the cutting table. It was a copy of Howard's appraisal. Valerie recognized the cover. Where did you get that? It came to Pine Grove. The appraisal company had mailed a courtesy copy to the tax address still listed in its working file. Howard had used Valerie's current address, but the outside appraiser had copied the older county record. Michelle opened to the final page. $1,400,000. Valerie removed the rotary cutter from the table and closed its blade. That copy should have come to me. Is that all you have to say? What would you like me to say? That you knew. I learned last week, and you didn't tell us. You didn't tell me the store owed $180,000 until you wanted Edward's letter. This changes everything. It changes the value. It changes what Dad would have wanted. Valerie looked at her. The property was worth the same amount when you gave me 30 days to leave. None of us knew it. Michelle lowered her voice. Dad thought it was an old camp. He knew how much shoreline it had. He couldn't have known prices would become this ridiculous. He made the trust irrevocable. Michelle's eyes shifted. Martin says that may be challenged. Then Martin should speak to Louis. We've hired someone else. Valerie closed the appraisal. For what? To represent Gary and me. Against whom? Michelle did not answer. The question had sounded too plain when spoken aloud. She slid the appraisal into her bag. We'd rather handle this without a hearing. What would that look like? You could agree to sell. Gary would receive enough to protect the store. You'd still have more than enough for yourself. How much is enough for me? I didn't mean it that way. How much? Michelle looked toward the back room. Half would be fair. Why? Because Dad had 2 children. He left each of you property and savings. The savings are going into the store. That's your choice. Gary could lose everything. So could I. You were comfortable with that when you thought the camp was worth $60,000. Michelle picked up her gloves. Andrew Salazar will contact Louis. Then there's nothing else to discuss here. You're really going to make us take this to court? Valerie met her eyes. I didn't hire the attorney. 3 days later, Andrew sent Louis a formal notice challenging the trust. He claimed Edward may not have understood the document after his heart scare in 2016. He also questioned why Valerie, as sole beneficiary, had supposedly known nothing about it. That part helps us, Louis said when Valerie read the letter in his office. If you didn't know, you couldn't have pressured Edward to sign. Andrew makes it sound suspicious. Andrew's job is to make ordinary facts sound suspicious long enough to obtain a hearing. Can he freeze the property? He can ask. Until the judge rules, don't sell, borrow against it, or begin major construction. I wasn't planning to sell. Good. Can I live there? Yes. The trust authorizes occupancy. Can Gary remove me? No. The hearing was scheduled for July in the probate division at Laconia. Andrew requested every document Louis possessed concerning Edward, the trust, and Loon Cove. Louis provided copies through the proper process. He did not hand over Valerie's originals. Gary and Michelle did not wait for the hearing. They came to the camp on a hot afternoon near the end of June. Kevin drove. Andrew sat in the front passenger seat. Valerie saw the vehicle at the chain while she and Dennis were repairing a porch rail. Gary pressed the horn twice. Valerie walked up the drive, but did not open the lock. Andrew stepped out and approached the chain. Mrs. Reeves, I'm Andrew Salazar. I know. We'd like to speak with you. You can speak from there. Gary looked past her toward the cottage. Open the chain, Valerie. No. Michelle remained beside the vehicle. Kevin stood near her, holding a folder. Andrew smiled without warmth. We're not here to cause trouble. Then this should be easy. We believe documents belonging to Edward's estate were removed from this property. They were addressed to me. That determination isn't yours alone. The originals are secure. Where? With me. It was not the answer he wanted. Andrew rested one hand on the granite post. If you provide the letter, deed fragment, and key, we can have neutral experts review them. Louis gave you copies. Copies don't allow examination of paper or ink. The recorded trust doesn't depend on paper found here. Andrew's smile disappeared. The recorded instrument may depend on Edward's capacity. In 2016, yes, 7 years before his cancer diagnosis, a heart event can affect cognition. So can wanting money. Gary stepped closer. This property was Dad's. You know that. It belonged to the trust. You didn't even know the trust existed. Neither did you. We're his children, and I was his wife. You were his wife for 22 years. We were his children all our lives. Valerie did not move toward the lock, and he provided for you. He didn't understand what this land was worth. Neither did you. Gary gripped the chain. Give us the key to the boathouse. No. What else is in there? Old rope, a rowboat, and tools. You expect me to believe that? I don't need you to believe me. Michelle came forward at last. Valerie, please. If you force this hearing, everything becomes public. You filed for the hearing. We can withdraw it. For half the property. For a fair settlement. Valerie looked from Michelle to Gary. They had come with an attorney, an accountant, a folder, and an offer made from the other side of a locked chain. They still called that avoiding conflict. There will be no settlement at the gate, she said. She turned and walked back to the cottage. Gary called after her. Dad wasn't well when he signed that thing. Valerie stopped. He continued because she had stopped. He was confused after the hospital. He forgot orders at the store. He repeated himself. Did you tell Martin that before or after you saw the appraisal? Gary's face reddened. Andrew touched his arm, but Gary pulled away. You weren't there for his whole life, he said. You don't get to use his last years to take everything. Valerie walked on. Dennis had heard enough from the porch to understand what happened. He did not ask what they wanted. Rails ready, he said. Valerie held the new section level while he drove the screws. The vehicle remained at the entrance for several minutes. Then Kevin backed onto the road and left. Pamela called that evening. I heard there's a hearing, she said. How? Michelle called me. Valerie sat at the pine table. What did she want? To ask whether Edward was confused near the end. What did you tell her? That people near death can have periods of confusion. Edward did. I also told her he was clear during several conversations that mattered. Pamela paused. One of those conversations was about Loon Cove. Valerie straightened. You said he only asked about the sewing chest. That was the first thing I remembered. After you called, I reviewed my visit notes. Why would you have written about the camp? Because he asked to speak without you in the room. I document private conversations when they concern safety, property, or family pressure. What did he say? He told me he'd placed the lake property in a trust for you years earlier. He said Gary might need money for the store, and Michelle would follow Kevin's advice. He was afraid they would treat the camp as part of the estate. Valerie pressed her fingertips against the table. He knew about the debt? Yes. Did he say how much? No. He said it had grown beyond what Gary admitted. Why didn't you tell me? Edward asked me not to. At the time, it was a confidential conversation with a patient who was capable of making decisions. And now? Now Michelle has asked me to question his capacity. I won't let my silence be used that way. Pamela brought her notes to Louis the following morning. They were dated in January and February. In one entry, Pamela had recorded Edward explaining the trust, the separate property, and the sewing chest. He had identified the year of signing, Louis's name, and Valerie's intended control after his death. Another entry described Edward's concern that his children might pressure Valerie to sell. Louis read every page. This doesn't prove his condition in 2016, he said. The witnesses and notary addressed that, but it proves he remembered the trust 10 years later and still understood exactly why he made it. Pamela signed a notarized statement. She also agreed to appear if the court required her. Michelle won't forgive me, she said after signing. Valerie looked at her. You don't owe me this. I owe the truth to the work I did. The hearing room in July was smaller than Valerie expected. A state flag stood behind the judge's bench. Wooden tables faced forward beneath bright ceiling lights. Several unrelated families waited along the back wall for their own cases. Gary, Michelle, and Kevin sat together, Andrew arranged 3 folders before them. Valerie sat beside Louis. Pamela and Dennis took seats behind her. Martin Bell attended as estate counsel, though he sat apart from both sides. When their case was called, Andrew stood first. He spoke calmly. He described Edward as a vulnerable man after a serious medical event. He called the trust secretive and unnatural. He said it removed a valuable family property without the knowledge of Edward's children, his regular estate attorney, or even Valerie herself. Then he placed Howard's appraisal before the court. This was not a sentimental gift of a failing cottage, Andrew said. It was the transfer of approximately $1,400,000 away from the decedent's family. Valerie watched Gary listen. He believed the figure made his claim stronger. Michelle believed their presence made the grievance look shared. Kevin believed a clean division could still be calculated. Andrew asked the court to declare the trust invalid and return Loon Cove to the estate for sale. He finished, buttoned his jacket, and sat down. Valerie left her folder closed while the judge turned to Louis. Louis stood and carried 1 certified copy to the clerk. "This case begins with a date," he said. June 23, 2016. He placed the recorded deed beside the trust. Edward Reeves transferred Loon Cove to an irrevocable trust nearly 10 years before his death. Valerie Reeves was named sole beneficiary and successor trustee. The registry accepted both instruments that morning. Andrew rose. "Recording does not establish capacity." "No," Louis said. "The witnesses, notary, and drafting record establish capacity." He added his office notes. They showed Edward had attended 2 meetings, requested changes, and returned a week later to sign. The judge examined the pages. "Mrs. Reeves knew nothing about this arrangement?" "No, Your Honor," Louis said. "Mr. Reeves believed she would object to receiving property separately from his children." Andrew looked toward Valerie. "That explanation comes from the attorney who drafted it. It also comes from Edward." Louis handed over the letter from the boathouse. Valerie was called to explain how she found it. She described opening Rose's chest in her rented room. She described weighing the spools, lifting the paper label, and finding the brass key inside the hollow wooden center. She described Edward's note directing her to Dennis and the loon's nest beneath the boathouse. Andrew approached after Louis finished. "That's what happened. And inside this supposed lake house, you found the documents needed to claim property worth $1,400,000. I found a letter and part of an older deed, after entering against the executor's instructions, before Gary proved he had any authority over it. You understood that discovery would benefit you. I understood my husband had asked me to find it." Andrew returned to his table. The court is being asked to accept an unusually convenient story. The judge looked at the certified trust. "The registry record did not come from the sewing chest, Mr. Salazar." Andrew sat down. Pamela testified next. She explained Edward's condition during hospice. She did not pretend he had always been clear. Some medicines made him drowsy. Some nights he became confused about time. Then Louis asked about the conversations recorded in her notes. "He told me he created the Loon Cove Trust after his heart hospitalization," Pamela said. "He named Mr. McDonald, the year, the beneficiary, and the reason the property was separate." "What reason?" "He wanted Valerie to have a secure home. He believed his other assets would go to Gary and Michelle. He was concerned the store's financial problems would cause pressure to sell the camp." Andrew stood. "Mrs. Cunningham, you did not treat Edward in 2016. No. Then you cannot testify about his capacity when he signed. I can testify that 10 years later, he accurately understood what he had signed." Louis placed Pamela's notarized statement beside the trust and registry copy. 3 records now lay together. Edward's signed decision from 2016. The county's permanent file. Pamela's dated account from his final weeks. Andrew offered no medical record showing incapacity at the time of signing. Gary's memories of repeated questions and missed orders had no dates. Under questioning, he admitted some incidents occurred years later. The judge removed her glasses. The property was transferred before death through a valid recorded instrument. It therefore did not enter the probate estate. Gary leaned toward Andrew, but Andrew raised one hand. "The petition to invalidate the trust is denied," the judge continued. "Valerie Reeves retains authority as successor trustee and sole beneficiary. The estate has no ownership interest in Loon Cove. The written order would follow, but the dispute ended in that room." Gary stared at the table. Michelle reached for Kevin's hand and missed it the first time. Valerie did not feel triumphant. She felt the release of something she had been carrying since Martin read 6 pages and closed his folder. Outside the courthouse, Gary caught up with her. "The store may close," he said. Valerie stopped beside Dennis's truck. "You still have the business, its accounts, and the savings Dad left you. It isn't enough. I'm sorry. You could help." "Yes," she said. "I could. I'm choosing not to put the camp behind your debt." His face hardened. "Then don't expect us to pretend we're family." "I stopped expecting that when you changed the lock." Gary walked away. Michelle remained near the courthouse door. After a moment, she approached alone. "Are you keeping the cottage?" she asked. "Yes. Will you sell later?" "I don't know." Michelle looked toward Gary's car. "I believe Dad had left you something. I just didn't check before asking you to leave. That was a choice too." "I know." It was not an apology, but it was the first thing Michelle had said without defending herself. "Can I call you sometime?" she asked. "You can call. If you come to the camp, ask first. Don't bring Kevin, Gary, or papers for me to sign." Michelle nodded. Valerie did not offer an embrace. Some relationships needed a locked gate before they could learn how to knock. She declined Howard's offer the next morning. He accepted her answer and asked her to remember his number if circumstances changed. Valerie arranged a modest renovation loan secured by the property. It was enough to repair the roof, restore the well, update the wiring, and brace the boathouse. She borrowed less than the bank offered. Dennis supervised the structural work but refused to supervise from a chair. Valerie found him carrying boards until she threatened to hide his truck keys. By late July, clean water ran from the kitchen tap. Valerie held a glass to the light, then drank it standing at the sink. In August, she left Ellen's room. The suitcase rode beside her in Nancy's station wagon. This time, it was not the whole measure of her life. It was simply luggage. She unpacked every piece. Her clothes went into the Lake Cottage's bedroom closet. Her mother's blue bowl went above the sink. Edward's photograph with Rose went on the mantel. The smaller room off the porch became a place for quilting and mending. Nancy donated a cutting table the shop no longer needed. Pamela brought a lamp. Dennis built shelves from pine boards removed during the repairs. Valerie stripped the damaged finish from Rose's sewing chest and rubbed the wood with oil. The scratches remained, but the chest no longer looked neglected. She placed it beneath the window where morning light reached the open trays. The first person who brought work was Ellen. She arrived with 2 pairs of trousers and the canvas bag Valerie had repaired months earlier. "The bag's still holding," Ellen said. "It ought to. I charge you $12. You charge Nancy. Then you owe her." They drank coffee on the porch while Valerie marked the trouser hems. If stories about reclaiming dignity after family abandonment matter to you, subscribe and return for the next inheritance story. Autumn reached Loon Cove slowly. One evening, Valerie set 4 places at the pine table for Dennis, Nancy, Pamela, and herself. Soup warmed on the stove. The repaired porch lamp shone across the path. Before they arrived, Valerie walked to the boathouse. She checked the fitted panel beneath Rose's painted loon, then locked it with the little brass key. She returned to the cottage as headlights moved between the trees. The sewing chest stood open beside the window. Thread filled its trays. Edward's letter rested safely elsewhere, no longer needed to prove where she belonged. Valerie turned the key in the front door, switched on the lamp, and welcomed her friends home.